And on that sad note, I think there's only one thing that can pick us up. Another paper. So I'm pleased to hear that we have Sumeyra Yakar with us, who holds a PhD from Exeter University, is now teaching in Turkey.
Yes, at University of Utrecht.
Yes, at that university. And she's going to offer a really interesting set of reflections on the use of sectarian religious interpretations according to Saudi and Iranian scholars. I've read the paper, it's really interesting, it's provocative, it's going to raise some interesting questions, hopefully a really good discussion as well. So over to you.
Yeah. Okay. First of all, I want to say thank you for winter school organizations that allowing me to share my information or my research. And I am a researcher of Islamic law. And if I put myself in a particular discipline, I can say that I am a legal historian or legal anthropologist, but its legal part is more than history or anthropology. And before starting, I also want to say that this is part of my thesis. I analyzed the use of custom in the legal area by Iranian and Saudi scholars. There was 3 types of comparison throughout my thesis. First, I compared the classical religious opinions of Jaferi and Hanbali scholars on the usage of custom. And then I compared the contemporary religious opinions known as fatwas related to social events belong to contemporary Hanbali and Jaferi scholars. And at the third part, I compared the court decisions related to civil law, known al-ahwal al-shakhsiyya in Saudi and Iranian judges' decisions. And there is a difference between what the text says, how a scholar interprets it, and how it's implemented in the practice. And my presentation deals with the methodological rejection or acceptance of custom depending on the bid'ah or innovation concept. My paper claims that connecting varieties only with the sectarian differences of countries doesn't offer reasonable explanation for the current situation in the MENA region. The influence of local custom during the interpretation of religious sources clarifies the attitudes of scholars towards the concept of bid'ah. I put the map and I noticed no one knows where Saudi Arabia and Iran. I want to make some clarification. At the northwest of Riyadh, where is the line? Okay, at this part of Riyadh, there is an area known as Qasmi, and the ruling family is coming from this part. And the location is famous with its education centers. On the other hand, in Riyadh, where is light? Okay, at this part of Tehran, there is a city known as Qum, and it has famous education centers. And when the scholars graduate from these education centers, they get their privilege. They get privileged situation among the society, among other scholars also. And there is a special requirement for Saudi judges and government workers to be educated in this particular part of Saudi Arabia. However, Qasim area is not open for international students or researchers. However, there is some international education centers in Qum for foreign peoples in order to get their education. And I collected my materials during my field research in Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I gave privilege status to the original sources comparing with the second-hand sources. The interviews with religious scholars and judges in Iran, especially, enabled me to gain a broad understanding of respondents' attitudes toward problems. And in Iran, my interviews was unsuccessful because of, I want to say, my sectarian identity, but it's just a justification. In Saudi Arabia, I use my sectarian identity. In Iran, I use my ethnic identity to communicate people easily. But my language problem was the main reason why I couldn't succeed to make interviews in Iranian judges or scholars. The research trips showed that the religious movements and their influence over the community have important place for religious rulings. And my main questions through the presentation is that how do the Saudi and Iranian scholars succeed in generating a workable religious system from the accumulation of Hanbali and Jafari works, and to what extent the treatment of bid'ah concept is different from each other, how the scholar referred to the concept of bid'ah for the rulings of Nowruz celebrations, and additionally, I tried to explain cultural presumptions within the process of ruling. The research has a comparative approach which brings together relevant literature, and textual legal analysis is the main methodological tool which I aim to bring together relevant literature with a view to contextualize and categorize the opinion of the scholar. In contributing to the literature, the paper considered the concept of bid'ah as a ground for legal justification or religious excuse. The concept offers a convincing reason to accuse outsiders as being others. At this point, the conflict between the followers of different sects came into existence. I choose General Presidency of Scholarly Research and IFTA, which is known Darul Ifta, as a primary source of religious interpretation for contemporary Saudi Arabia, because the institution is responsible for conducting religious research and solving problems. It has also sanctioning power over Saudi citizens. I took the religious opinions of contemporary Iranian scholars from the official websites of Marji Itaklits, known as source of imitation, and the religious opinion known fatwa reflect the standpoint of the religious scholars in relation to problematic and novel issues. There is an answer and question issued by a religious expert on a particular area. They also reflect the tension between religious orders as prescribed in religious texts and customary values. The detailed explanation of bid'ah, according to Iranian and Saudi understanding, reveals a synthesis between the practice and theory by modifying the usage of rational justification and secondary principles. Why I choose Saudi Arabia and Iran? Because there are more similarities comparing with the differences. First of all, the Saudi authorities emphasize the use of classical Islamic law, and it's neither codified nor constitutionalized. They implement the Wahhabi-interpreted Hanbali school of law in general, especially in the field of personal relations, and they represent themselves as a protector of Sunni belief system and aims to create Islamic culture. On the other hand, the legal system of Iran uses codified regulations, and Iranian state supports the implementation of Jafari school of law, especially in the field of personal relations, and they represent themselves as a protector of Shia belief system and aims Islamization of culture. And there is no separation between legislative, executive, and judicial branches in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudi system experienced modernization through state-issued decree laws known as Marsum al-Malik. On the other hand, there is a peculiar separation between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches in Iran, and modernization of rulings happens through the interpretation of the judges. On the other hand, Islamic law plays a crucial role in the survival of both these countries and establishes the parameters of what is permissible. And within this framework, a great variety of individually unique and culturally specific relationships can exist. Thus, the objective of creating virtuous Muslim society is the principal agenda of both countries. And in both countries, there are strong connections between the state organizations, ruler and state institutions, or religious institutions, as a religio-political theory. There is an alliance between Saudi ulama and Saudi umara and ulama, scholars and rulers, and the concept of walayat al-faqih, governance of jurists in Iran. Depending on this theory, the religious scholars are the main interpreters of Islamic law, and rulers or political authorities are the implementers of rules and protectors of Islamic legal system. And as stated in the articles of both countries, Islamic law constitutes the main foundation and basis of their legal system. It might be asserted that the application of Islamic law within these legal systems implicitly refers to Muslim identity and Islamic character of the countries. And religious organizations in both countries sought to propagate their practices and tenets outside their own countries with the aim of achieving universal expansion. This was achieved by publishing religious literature or establishing and supporting international organizations. And the active relationship or communication between education centers and governmental actors shapes the way of political obedience and religious understanding of people. And these religious education centers are mainly controlled and supported by the government, and their curriculum are controlled by the governmental officials in both countries. So education is used to protect and control the sectarian identity of their citizens. And the scholars of two countries are unique because they integrated their national identity during their religious interpretation. So it's the Saudi identity or Iranian national identity is noticeable in their religious interpretation. And both countries use the image of women in order to prove their Muslim or in order to prove their national religiosity. There is a abaya policy in Saudi Arabia, and there is scarf policy in Iran. Even if a person is not a Muslim believer, they are supposed to follow these regulations, and this made some change in the religious rulings. And what else? Okay, I can skip. And the linguistic definition of the bid'ah refers to innovate, to create, or to bring something into being in a way that wasn't before. But the terminological definition of bid'ah from religious and legal dimension refers to innovation, and this is a belief or practice for which there was no practice in the time of the Prophet, his companions, or their followers. The innovator, Ahl al-Bid'ah, the term that is used as an opposite of Ahl al-Sunnah, is the one who introduced something new on an arbitrary principle without having any legal basis in the foundations of Islam. So the innovation might be considered good and praiseworthy or bad and blameworthy from religious dimension, but mainly it's considered as having negative connotation. So the varieties in the definition, interpretation, and categorization of bid'ah have become a subject of controversy among the Muslim believers up until present day, and results in accusation for the followers of other groups as wrongdoers. So The doctrine of bid'ah, in addition to religio-political atmosphere of Saudi region, underpinned the foundation of Wahhabi movement and establishment of the Saudi kingdom. According to Wahhabi point of view, Islam had been corrupted by introduction of reprehensible innovations in religious practices and by society's deviation from religious principles during the Ottoman Sultanate. Therefore, most of Muslims were not to be considered Muslim because of their sinful acts or violation towards God's order. According to the supporters of the Wahhabi movement, the views of scholars, textual interpretations or religious opinions that were produced after 3rd century must be revised and can be refused upon contradicting with the main sources of Islam and their literal meaning. So the followers of Wahhabi movement paid attention to the religious purification and extracted highly respected tombs, monuments, historical and immoral places, and damaged particular books that might lead to astral-like philosophy, and abolish special positions among the community and commemoration of the birthday of Prophet, depending on bid'ah concept. Even though the Wahhabi movement has been experienced change and reforms throughout time, the movement protects its main doctrines and controls the society by issuing religious verdicts and preparing the curricula for religious education. However, the Iranian scholars show positive attitude and claim that if a new practice is in harmony with the pillars of Islam, orders of Quran, teachings of Prophet, and Imams, it cannot be considered as an offensive act or innovation, and the violation of Islamic source or orders is considered the main criteria of evaluation process rather than the actual novelty of the case. The announcement of lawful things as forbidden or vice versa, relying on personal opinions, additions in the order of God, alterations in the practices of Prophet, or changes in religious rituals are assessed inside the concept of bid'ah. They support the permissibility of act or partial rejection of act rather than complete rejection of it, such as permission visiting the tombs or partial acceptance of Nowruz celebrations. For example, the rejection of temporary marriage, known as mut'a, by Sunni scholars is considered bid'ah by Jaferi scholars. Since it was practiced during the time of Prophet Muhammad, no one can abolish it, but the companions abolished it, so Sunni people created a kind of bid'ah in the religion. This is how Jaferi scholars interpret the situation. And since the cult of shrines plays an important role in Jaferi understanding, the shrines were designed with characteristic architectures and were adorned with beautiful ornamentation. Additionally, these places are considered important Shi'i learning centers, and educational institutions were established around them, and the intersection with imams for their followers is also among the accepted doctrine in Shia understanding that completely contradict with the Wahhabi doctrine. In this picture, only the right bottom picture is considered bid'ah according to Iranians, but all of them is considered inside the bid'ah concept according to Wahhabi understanding. So, what is rejected by Wahhabi scholars, depending on the concept of bid'ah or heretical innovation, is considered within the framework of commendable religious acts according to Shia scholars. The logical justification behind the interpretations of religious orders reveals the distinctive character of the scholars and reflects the socio-cultural environment of the movements. So, I analyzed the case of Nowruz celebration to see the effects of theory in practice. Nowruz means new day, and the festival embodies the sense of rebirth, revival that coincides with the arrival of spring. It originates within the pre-Islamic Zoroastrian tradition that were dominant in ancient Persia. The relationship between Nowruz celebration and Zoroastrianism is clearly depicted in the bonfire ritual that is held on the eve of last Wednesday, which is considered to be unluckiest night of the year. In general, the customary event can be a normative, prescribed, repeatable, prohibited, or obligatory according to its symbolical relationship with the old religions. So, Wahhabi and Shia scholars have issued religious opinions or known fatwas that address the Nowruz festival. I will try to answer how customary and sectarian influences impacted four separate fatwas, and my analysis focuses on to identify the legal methodology and principles adopted by the scholars, to understand how the scholars tackle issues related to customary practices, and which social and political factors influence the result of interpretation. So, the first religious opinion used the Quranic verses and prophetic narrations that derive from the Sunni hadith sources or Sunni educational environment by applying the secondary sources of Islamic law, like public interest or prohibition of harm. It's assumed that participation in these customary festivals bring a degradation of faith. And the scholars also emphasize that the Arabian Peninsula should be kept free of infidels and other religious traditions by prioritizing Islamic culture of the region. The second fatwa provides a linguistic exploration of the Nowruz, and the dominated insistency on the literal meaning of the word by Wahhabi scholars is noticeable, since the analysis focuses on the linguistic root of the word and its terminological connection with the Persian language. In more detail, the scholars thought that bid'ah or heretical innovation may have crept into religion and displaced the core belief of Islam that is revealed in the sources. They introduced the socio-practical principle of association with Muslim and disassociation from infidels, which arranges and controls personal relations between believers and non-believers in the legal sphere. And on the other hand, Khamenei's response doesn't prohibit the Nowruz celebrations, and on the contrary, it encourages participation in the festivals upon the basis that this will reinforce and promote national identity. In emphasizing the principle of public interest and national unity, the religious opinion endorses the Nowruz celebration and evaluates its potential benefits over anticipated harmful effects. The second opinion offers more descriptive explanations and refers to Jaferi textual sources. The previous one refers Sunni textual sources, but this one uses Jaferi textual sources. And the responses support some activities such as visiting relatives and participating in the celebration, but they systematically aim to maintain a rejective attitude towards the fire performance by emphasizing its connection with the old Zoroastrian belief. The opinion seeks to preserve the traditional norms by accommodating custom to the Islamic law in a way that preserves the balance between law and custom. At this point, the expectation that underpins the rule is that it will be possible to bridge a gap between theory and practice in a manner that mirrors custom and Islamic law within contemporary Iran. The general positive appraisal in the opinions is further underlined by the fact that it establishes chronological links between Nowruz Day and the acts of prophet and symbolical events of the imams. So the opinions in general shows us the multidimensional sides of legal thought, the tension between the implementation of Islamic law and engagement with the custom. Consequently, it might be assumed that Saudi Wahhabi scholars are more protective and restrictive on the issue of customary celebrations than their Iranian Jafari counterparts. Thus, the influence of religion upon custom can be clearly depicted in Saudi religious opinions, while the converse is thus understandable from Iranian religious opinions. The idea is connected with the opinion that Saudi Arabia is the birthland of Islam, Iran is the adopted land of Islam. In operating under the protection of these verdicts, the Saudi scholars have encouraged the production of Islamic custom rather than adoption of the practices of non-Saudi societies, but they haven't yet clarified which criteria or parameters is usable during the decision process. However, Iranians permit custom to be shaped in accordance with religious criteria, and this gave us Islamization of culture. So these scholars consider custom inside the framework of Islam, and Iranians approve the reality of non-Islamic custom. Even if the methodology and sources of Islamic law impact upon scholars' decision, the nation-oriented customary dynamics might affect the religious opinions, and the custom manifests as an important element during the decision-making process, and it should be considered alongside the meaning which underpin religious texts and principles. Irrespective of whether there is a direct reference to custom, the interpretation of textual sources, the use of legal principles have a relatively close connection to the surrounding contextual environment. However, the extensive use of customary norms in the absence of religious sources or in the interpretation of religious texts and consideration of bid'ah concept might be in excess of permitted legal limits. The sectarian identity, being Hanbali and Jafari, doesn't create tension for the issues related to civil law. However, the sectarian identity, being Wahhabi or Shia, might lead problems for the issues related to social events and politics. And thank you.
Good job. Do you want some water?
Yeah, I have mine.
You have some? You're okay? You don't need anything else?
Yeah, that's enough.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Sumeyra, for that paper. It's really interesting stuff, raises some really interesting questions, and I think those questions span a range of different, disciplines, sort of operating at the borderlands, like Morten is more than happy to refer to. Where are my notes here? Here, okay. So I found it really interesting to read the paper and hear these sort of reflections on the different ways of Islamic law being constructed. And perhaps this is me projecting my own ideas and research onto it. I wonder if there's more to it than what you're exploring. How would you identify yourself?
I am a legal scholar.
A legal scholar.
I am working on Islamic law rather than the sectarian identity.
Yeah.
But okay,
Just keep it short.
Okay, there is kind of schools, and I.
No, Sumeyra.
Okay.
Just tell me, what discipline would you identify?
Islamic law.
Islamic law. Okay.
I mean the legal history.
Yeah. Okay.
the history of Islamic law, where the all
Yeah.
jurisprudence or rulings are coming from,
Yeah.
how these people solve their personal issues, and how the during the presentations of some participants, I noticed that there is somehow misconception with the identity of with the definition of sects. And in Islamic jurisprudence, especially in the Sunni tradition, there is sects of political understanding, and there is school of law for daily life, especially worships and personal issues. And I mainly interested with this school of law rather than the political schools of political schools
Yep.
or political sects. And however, I can see the effect of this practical school in theological schools. So I mainly interested with these practical schools rather than the theological ones.
Because it struck me that as I was reading the paper and listening to you talk, there's some really quite serious political repercussions of the Islamic from the Islamic jurisprudence that you're talking about, right?
Yes.
That you're not just talking pure jurisprudence, but you're talking about the political repercussions of jurisprudence.
Yes.
Yeah?
If the issue is related to worship area
Yeah.
or civil law, we can't see the effect of politics too much, because the power of scholars is higher or more comparing to other effects. These are the areas for praying, fasting, or marriage, divorce, inheritance, and we can see the influence of schools, and there is no problem, everyone can do this, and this doesn't create a problem between the peoples. It's a kind of normal thing for a government to approve this. However, if the issues is related to siyasi şer'iye, politics in accordance with the Islamic law, then we can see that the power of state, ruler, or authorities is higher than the power of scholars, because rulers can use Islamic law in order to control the society. So there is a kind of distinction between these areas.
That's true. But if you'll excuse me, I'm trying to find an author for you, and I'll do that in a minute. It strikes me that there are political repercussions of your paper. And I think that the thing that I would have liked to see most in the paper that wasn't really there is an acknowledgement of the political repercussions, and an acknowledgement and more explicit reflections on those political repercussions. Like, for example, you talk about women's dress.
Yes.
Right? That's a fundamentally political issue. The way in which that this is constructed, granted from jurisprudence, but it has political repercussions for day-to-day life, right? So it struck me that was one thing that could really bring the paper together, because you've got these two different sets of comparisons, these two different sets of reflections here. And it may be, again, and I'll apologize if this is me projecting onto you, Sumeyra, so please forgive me if so.
That's okay.
But it strikes me that there's a way of bringing this all together by looking at the impact of these religious interpretations on political life. And that would allow you to bring these two distinct cases together. And, I mean, it got me reflecting about Nowruz. Okay, why was it that you decided that Nowruz was the thing to use, given that there are quite political repercussions for picking Nowruz in one state rather than the other? So even if you're approaching it from a jurisprudential way, you're doing it from a heavily politically charged position, right? So I guess there's 2 points at issue here. One is, how do you bring it all together to make it hold? And then what's the issue that you choose to bring all these distinct aspects together in a way that is intellectually neutral, perhaps, is the way to do it. And that leads me on to a question about your own positionality. Right? How do you situate yourself in these discussions? Excuse me. And then you were talking about identity building and state formation at times, and I wonder, this is probably again outside of your discipline, but you're referring to it in the paper. So I think it's worth looking at some of these debates and some of these literatures on identity building and the role of religion in identity building and state building. Someone like Joseph Niveau is a really good person to look at. And Madawi al-Rashid, of course. And she does this in the context of the female body and how the female body is used as the particular manifestation of an image of the state. And you were alluding to this in the paper. So I think that it's worth grounding that in these other types of literatures, which are, of course, far more political than you are used to. But given that you're speaking to that anyway, I think it's worth drawing on those literatures that are existing, that are out there, that can really strengthen the types of things that you're trying to do. Now, you also talk about theological aspects, and you talk about Wahhabism quite a lot for obvious reasons. But one of the things that struck me is that you're someone who's well qualified to talk about Islamic jurisprudence. Okay, you've got the training, you've got the expertise, you've got the knowledge. But you were using some interesting references here. You're using Thomas Headkammer and Stéphane Lecroix, who are Middle East politics scholars, and in the case of Headkammer, a scholar of jihadism. So that surprised me, given that you are far better qualified to talk about the jurisprudential aspects of Wahhabism than either of those two. So I think it's worth thinking very carefully about the types of literature that you're engaging with, particularly when you're starting to stray out from where you are perhaps most comfortable, thinking very carefully about the scholars that you're engaging with and why you're engaging with them, because they're coming at it from a particular background. They've got their own positionality, and that shapes how the reader interprets your work as well, of course. The types of sources shape how the reader will engage with what it is that you're saying. My last point is you talk about, two final points. I think there's an interesting tension that emerges in constitutions, and I'm really curious to hear your way of analysing this in terms of sovereignty, the source of sovereignty, right? And you talk about the Saudi constitution and the Iranian constitution, and you stress that in the articles, God is the source of all sovereign power, right?
Yes.
But then if you go through the remainder of the constitutions, there are certain clauses at play that say that it's the king that is the one that is making all these decisions, right? But the king isn't sovereign, God is sovereign. And if the king goes against God's sovereignty, or the king goes against the clerics, you see there's a bit of a tension here. And I'm curious, as a scholar of jurisprudence, how does that tension get resolved? And what does that tension mean for your paper here? Okay? And then you've talked about a claim and a desire to create a virtuous Muslim society which is paralleled by an authentic Muslim state. How does that sit in regard to this particular comparative project? It strikes me that that is maybe a different project, a different set of questions, a different set of reflections to this comparative issue with regard to Nowruz, perhaps. So I'd just be curious to hear you say a little bit on that. And I think that's where I'll leave it. I mean, there's so much really interesting stuff here, and it's really important that we draw on, or we contribute our understanding of sectarianism with approaches from different disciplinary backgrounds and different types of sources beyond just doing interviews or looking at archival documents. I think it's really important to go to the source texts in terms of theology anyway. And I think that's what the strength of your article does, by bringing out the constitutional document, but also the Quranic text as well. And I think that's where there's really interesting traction that you're making with the paper. So I think it's just a case of maybe reflecting on exactly what you want to get out of the paper, what you want it to do, what debate you want to contribute to. I've said this a few times now, but the elevator pitch, forcing you to think, I'm contributing to knowledge in this specific area, because then you'll be pursuing that across the paper. But I'm going to try and find the name of the scholar that I'm trying to think of that escapes me now, but he's written on some of the things that you were perhaps hinting towards. But perhaps if you just have a quick response to some of these points, and then we can open the floor for questions. But I'll just say, really enjoyed it. It forced me to think about things in a different way. And that's the point of this workshop, right? Forcing us all to think about things in a different type of way, learning from each other, and I've certainly learned a lot. So thank you.
Welcome. And, okay. I mentioned about women dress codes and using woman picture in order to show religiosity of the government. So this is used by 2 countries, and when I check the explanations, I couldn't find enough legal ground. I mean, it was, okay, it's obvious, it's an Islamic regulation, but why they are making this obligatory for all citizens is not clear. So they are just they just impose their ideas to control or to increase their dominant situation within the communities. And I choose Nowruz celebration, but at the same time, I analyze different cases. There is a ban for women driving in Saudi Arabia, and at the initial procedure, when I analyzed the fatwas that's issued related to this area, they said this is purely Islamic regulation. And when they get negative critics from outsiders, the well-known scholar issued another fatwa, and he said it can be possible for other countries to permit the woman to drive a car, but it's not approvable according to our culture. So this was my another comparison, and there is also conflicts on the issue of announcement of the fasting, announcement of the Muslim festival days. For example, at the end of month Ramadan, all Muslims start their celebration, but sometimes particular countries start it earlier and others start it very late. This issue is related to the issue. I mean, we can see the effect of School of Law over the countries' decisions, because in Saudi Arabia there is a kind of rejection for the technology depending on the bid'ah concept, and they said we should see the moon with our own eyes. So that because of that, they reject the use of technology for the determination of date. On the other hand, other countries use technological accounting in order to specify the date. So this is another fatwa. And in medicine, there is huge debates, and the countries seek or ask the opinion of the scholars in order to create a regulation to use all around the country. especially for Saudi Arabia, the Darul Ifta is responsible to arrange regulations to solve the problems within the country. And I choose this kind of social cases in order to understand the power of scholars in social areas. And if the issue creates conflict between the power of ruler or the power of scholars in civil areas, the scholars win the debate. But if the religious opinions start to insult or start to damage the power of ruler, then rulers can change the scholars, and they can use Sharia in order to make the citizens to obey the regulations. I mean, this is one way of using Sharia in the political atmosphere in order to control the society. And the idea comes from Ibn Taymiyyah, a well-known Salafi scholar. And according to his political theory, I mean, politics in accordance with Islamic law, if Muslim rulers do not make any violation against the Islamic rules, it's not permissible for people to make rebellion against the ruler. So this stops people to make rebel against the political authority, and there is prescribed punishment for particular crimes, and countries who apply Sharia use these prescribed punishments, including execution or death penalty, in order to stop outsiders or protesters. Okay. As I say, my research area is Islamic law. I mainly didn't look for literature related to identity buildings, but I use Madawi Rashid's books because there was quite limited English literature in terms of Saudi Arabia and Iran. And whatever I found, I just categorized them, but it's quite restricted even in Arabic or even in English. There is just a few written books on the Saudi legal system and the Iranian jurisprudence also. And
I can give you some names that might be useful.
yeah.
And if you speak to Toby nicely, I'm sure he can too.
Probably. Okay, I know Al-Atane. Al-Atane Vogel Stateward is for Saudi Arabia, and Mahayamani also. And then for Iran, only Zibamir Husseini and Sheikh Lahiri are the main writers on the legal jurisprudence. I mean, it's quite similar, quite restrictive. And what else?
Okay?
I think I finished my notes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, let's open the floor then. We've got a bit of time. 1, 2, 3, 4.